The Pacific dawn of June 3, 1942 painted the vast ocean in shades of gold and crimson, but Admiral Chester Nimitz knew this serene beauty masked an approaching tempest that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. From his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet studied the intercepted Japanese radio transmissions with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient's vital signs. The codename AF had been mentioned repeatedly in enemy communications, and thanks to the brilliant cryptanalysts at Station HYPO, Nimitz now knew with chilling certainty that AF meant Midway Atoll, a strategic speck of coral and sand that would soon become the graveyard of empires. The Japanese combined fleet, under the command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was sailing toward what they believed would be their greatest victory since Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto, the architect of the December 7th attack, had conceived Operation Me as the decisive blow that would force America to negotiate a favorable peace. His plan was audacious in its scope. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces north, while the main Japanese fleet would strike Midway, capture the atoll, and destroy the remaining American carrier force when it inevitably came to reclaim the lost territory. What Yamamoto didn't know was that his encrypted messages had been broken by Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers working in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters. These unsung heroes had penetrated the Japanese Navy's most secret communications, giving Nimitz an unprecedented glimpse into enemy intentions. The intelligence was so detailed that Nimitz knew not only where the Japanese would strike, but when and with what forces. The American Pacific Fleet had been devastated at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, losing 8 battleships and over 2,400 lives in a single morning of infamy. Since then, the United States had been fighting a desperate defensive war, trading space for time while American industry geared up for total war. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April had provided a morale boost, but it had also stung Japanese pride and convinced their leadership that aggressive action was necessary to establish a defensive perimeter that would make further American attacks impossible. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative history of United States naval operations in World War II, the strategic importance of Midway could not be overstated. Located approximately 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, the atoll served as an early warning station and refueling stop for American forces. Its capture would not only eliminate this threat but also provide Japan with a forward base from which to threaten Hawaii itself. Nimitz faced an impossible decision. His available forces were vastly outnumbered by the approaching Japanese armada. Yamamoto commanded 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers, a force that represented the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Against this massive fleet, Nimitz could muster only 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back from the Coral Sea battle with damage that should have required months to repair but was patched up in just 72 hours through the Herculean efforts of Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers. The odds were daunting, but Nimitz possessed something more valuable than numbers: perfect intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. He knew that surprise, the weapon that had served Japan so well at Pearl Harbor, would now be turned against them. The trap was set, and the hunters were about to become the hunted. The pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942 enveloped the Pacific like a shroud as two mighty fleets converged on the tiny atoll of Midway. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force from the bridge of the Akagi, felt the confidence that came from leading the most experienced naval aviation force in the world. His pilots had honed their skills in the crucible of combat across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies, and they had never known defeat. The 4 carriers under his command, Akagi, Kaga, Haryu, and Soryu, represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power, their flight decks laden with the most advanced aircraft in the Imperial Navy. Unknown to Nagumo, Admiral Raymond Sp. aboard the Enterprise and Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher on the Yorktown had positioned their forces northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance but perfectly positioned to strike when the moment came. The American commanders had spent the night reviewing their attack plans, knowing that they would have perhaps one chance to catch the Japanese carriers with their aircraft on deck, vulnerable and laden with fuel and ammunition. The battle began at 4:30 in the morning when a PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Lieutenant Howard Addy, spotted the Japanese fleet approaching from the northwest. His radio crackled with excitement as he reported the sighting. Enemy carriers bearing 260, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25 knots. The long-awaited moment had arrived, and across the American fleet, general quarters sounded as thousands of sailors rushed to their battle stations. On Midway itself, the small garrison of Marines and Navy personnel prepared for what they knew would be a devastating assault. Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the 6th Marine Defense Battalion, had positioned his men and equipment with the care of a chessmaster arranging pieces for a crucial endgame. The island's runways held a motley collection of aircraft, obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, a handful of modern Grumman Wildcats, and several squadrons of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers and Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers. At 6:15, the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Midway like a swarm of angry hornets. 108 planes, K torpedo bombers converted for level bombing, Val dive bombers, and Zero fighters descended upon the tiny atoll with devastating precision. The Marine fighters rose to meet them, but the obsolete Buffaloes were no match for the superior Zeros. In minutes, the sky above Midway was filled with the deadly ballet of aerial combat, while below, the Japanese bombs began to fall like thunder. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the Japanese strike, radioed back to Nagumo that a second attack would be necessary to neutralize Midway's defenses. This message would prove to be one of the most consequential communications of the entire war. Nagumo faced a critical decision. Should he prepare his reserve aircraft for a second strike on Midway, or should he arm them with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for the anticipated battle with the American fleet? The intelligence failure that would doom the Japanese fleet was already manifesting. Japanese reconnaissance had been inadequate, and Nagumo remained unaware that 3 American carrier groups were closing in on his position. At 7:28, a Japanese scout plane finally reported the presence of American ships, but the pilot failed to identify them as carriers. It wasn't until 8:20 that the devastating news reached Nagumo. Enemy force, accompanied by what appears to be a carrier bearing 010, distance 240 miles from Midway, as documented in Gordon Pranga's comprehensive study Miracle at Midway. This moment marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. Nagumo now faced the nightmare scenario that every carrier commander dreaded: enemy carriers within striking distance, while his own flight decks were cluttered with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The decision to change the armament of his reserve aircraft from land attack weapons to anti-ship weapons had created chaos below decks. With ordnance scattered across the hangar bays and fuel lines snaking everywhere, the stage was set for one of the most decisive naval battles in history, where superior intelligence and timing would prove more valuable than numerical superiority. The morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific as the fate of 2 nations hung in the balance. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had become floating volcanoes, their decks and hangars packed with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance in a deadly combination that would soon prove catastrophic. The Japanese admiral found himself caught between 2 fires: the need to launch a second strike against Midway's still dangerous defenses, and the urgent requirement to prepare for battle against the American carriers that had appeared like ghosts on his eastern horizon. At 9:25, the first American attack wave reached the Japanese fleet. 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornets Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, approached the enemy carriers in a desperate low-level attack. These obsolete aircraft, flying at barely 100 feet above the waves, were sitting ducks for the swarming Zero fighters and the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the Japanese fleet. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 Devastators had been shot down, their crews becoming martyrs in the cold Pacific waters. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was followed by similar devastating losses as torpedo squadrons from the Enterprise and Yorktown pressed home their attacks with obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds. The American torpedo bombers were slaughtered, with only 4 of the 41 aircraft managing to survive their attacks. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese Zero fighters had been drawn down to sea level to massacre the torpedo bombers, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. FANDED. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, spotted the Japanese fleet spread out below like toys on a blue carpet. The carriers Akagi and Kaga were clearly visible, their flight decks packed with aircraft preparing for launch. McCluskey's decision to continue searching beyond his planned return point, despite fuel running dangerously low, had led him to this, the moment of supreme opportunity. The attack that followed changed the course of the Pacific War in a matter of minutes. McCluskey's dive bombers screamed down from 14,000 feet, their sirens wailing like banshees as they plunged toward their targets. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the 1st Division, put his 1,000-pound bomb directly through the flight deck of the Akagi, while other bombs struck the Kaga with similar devastating effect. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, attacked the Soryu with equal precision. The Japanese carriers, caught with their aircraft armed and fueled, became infernos within minutes. The Nagumo's flagship was transformed from a proud warship into a blazing wreck as fires spread through her hangar decks, detonating bombs and torpedoes in a chain reaction of destruction. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Nagara, watched in horror as 3 of his 4 carriers were reduced to burning hulks in the span of 6 minutes. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu, facing the destruction of his ship, chose to go down with his vessel rather than abandon his post. His sacrifice epitomized the Bushido spirit of the Japanese Navy, but it could not save his burning carrier from its fate. The Kaga, under Captain Jisaku Okada, suffered a similar doom as explosions ripped through her hull, sending aircraft and men tumbling into the sea. Only the Haryu remained operational from Nagumo's once mighty carrier force. Her captain Tomio Kaku immediately launched a counterattack against the American fleet, determined to exact revenge for the devastation that had befallen his consorts. At noon, 18 Val dive bombers and 60 fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, found the Yorktown and scored 3 direct hits on the American carrier. The Yorktown, already bearing battle damage from the Coral Sea, seemed mortally wounded as fires blazed across her flight deck and she listed heavily to port. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered his crew to abandon ship, but the veteran carrier's damage control parties performed miracles, and within 2 hours she was operational again, her flight deck patched and her fires extinguished. The resilience of American damage control would prove crucial in the hours to come. As the battle was far from over, the Japanese still had fight left in them, and the outcome of this pivotal engagement remained uncertain as both fleets prepared for the final phase of the confrontation. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the Pacific as the crippled giants of both fleets struggled to continue the fight. Admiral Yamaguchi Taman, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the Haryu, was determined to salvage victory from the morning's catastrophe. His carrier, the sole survivor of Nagumo's strike force, had become the last hope of the Japanese fleet. The experienced admiral, known for his aggressive tactics and innovative thinking, prepared to launch every available aircraft in a desperate bid to even the odds. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the Haryu's second strike wave took off into the clear Pacific sky. 10 K torpedo bombers and 60 fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who had commanded the morning attack on Midway, flew eastward toward the American fleet. Tominaga's aircraft had been damaged in the earlier mission, its fuel tank punctured by defensive fire, but the dedicated pilot refused to be replaced. Knowing that his experience might make the difference between success and failure, the Japanese strike found the Yorktown just as her crew had completed emergency repairs from the morning's damage. The American carrier appeared to be fully operational, her flight deck busy with aircraft operations, presenting what seemed to be a fresh target to the attacking Japanese pilots. Captain Buckmaster's damage control teams had performed what many considered impossible, bringing their ship back from the brink of destruction through sheer determination and skilled seamanship. The torpedo attack that followed was executed with a precision that had made Japanese naval aviation feared throughout the Pacific. 2 Type 91 torpedoes struck the Yorktown's port side, causing massive flooding and knocking out her electrical power. The veteran carrier, which had survived the morning's dive-bombing attack through the heroic efforts of her crew, finally succumbed to the overwhelming damage. Captain Buckmaster, realizing that his ship was beyond saving, gave the order to abandon ship at 3 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Tominaga, his fuel exhausted and his aircraft damaged beyond hope of return, chose to make the ultimate sacrifice. Rather than attempt a hopeless journey back to the Haryu, he dove his crippled Kate into the Yorktown's flight deck in a final act of defiance. His death symbolized the desperate courage that both sides displayed in this titanic struggle, where individual heroism was measured not in medals but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. Admiral Sprints, now commanding the American force after Fletcher's transfer to a cruiser, faced a critical decision. The loss of the Yorktown had reduced his carrier's strength by 1/3, but intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had only one operational carrier remaining. The question was whether to continue the attack or withdraw to preserve his remaining forces for future operations. As documented in Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, Spruance's decision to continue the offensive proved to be one of the most crucial command decisions of the Pacific War. At 4:30, he launched 24 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, with orders to find and destroy the remaining Japanese carrier. The American pilots, flying through scattered clouds and intermittent rain squalls, searched the vast Pacific for their elusive target. At 5, they spotted the Hiryu, her flight deck crowded with aircraft preparing for a third strike against the American fleet. The Japanese carrier, unaware of the approaching danger, continued her preparations for what her crew hoped would be the decisive blow of the battle. Gallagher's dive bombers attacked with the same precision that had devastated the morning's targets. For direct hits struck the Hiryu's flight deck and hangar, igniting fuel and ammunition in a massive fireball that could be seen for miles. Admiral Yamaguchi, realizing that his ship was doomed, chose to remain aboard rather than transfer to another vessel. His final message to Admiral Yamamoto was both a confession of failure and a testament to the courage of his men. Hiryu damaged and unnavigable. We will do our best to destroy enemy carriers. The destruction of the Hiryu marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force in the Pacific War. In one day, the Imperial Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers and many of its most experienced pilots, losses that could never be replaced. The elite aviators who had trained for years before the war, the men who had struck Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were gone forever. The evening of June 4, 1942 descended upon the Pacific like a curtain, falling on a tragedy of epic proportions. For Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, lay burning and sinking in the dark waters, their twisted metal frames serving as monuments to the day's catastrophic defeat. The Akagi Kaga, Soryu, and Heryu, which had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, were now funeral pyres drifting slowly beneath the waves, taking with them not only thousands of tons of irreplaceable steel but also the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, received the devastating reports with a stoic composure that had made him a legend in the Japanese Navy. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months to a year, now faced the bitter reality that his timeline had been tragically accurate. The 6 months were up, and American industrial might was beginning to assert itself with devastating effectiveness. The human cost of the day's battle was staggering. The Akagi took down with her captain Taijiro Aoki and over 200 members of her crew. The Kaga's captain Jisaku Okada survived the initial explosions but chose to remain with his ship as she settled beneath the waves, taking over 800 officers and men to their graves. The Soryu's captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto, who had refused rescue attempts, was last seen standing on his bridge as the carrier rolled over and sank, carrying over 700 souls into the depths. Perhaps most tragic was the fate of the Hiryu and her gallant commander, Admiral Yamaguchi. The 50-year-old admiral, considered one of the most promising leaders in the Japanese Navy, had supervised the evacuation of his crew before choosing to remain aboard his burning flagship. As flames consumed the carrier around him, Yamaguchi was seen standing calmly on the bridge, his sword in his hand, preparing for seppuku. His final radio message to the fleet was a masterpiece of understated courage. I am going to share the fate of my ship. I am grateful for the magnificent efforts of all my officers and men. The loss of experienced pilots was perhaps even more devastating than the loss of ships. Japan had entered the war with approximately 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots, men who had undergone years of rigorous training and combat experience. At Midway, over 100 of these irreplaceable airmen perished in a single day, including many squadron commanders and veteran pilots whose experience could not be replaced. The Imperial Navy's training programs, already strained by the demands of the expanding war, could not produce replacements of comparable quality. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron of Torpedo Squadron 8, whose sacrifice had helped draw the Japanese fighters down to sea level, was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his heroic leadership. His final message to his squadron before the attack captured the spirit of American determination. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. Waldron's prediction that they would not return proved tragically accurate. But his squadron's sacrifice had contributed directly to the victory. The Yorktown, abandoned but still afloat, presented a tempting target for the Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe. On June 6, the submarine fired 4 torpedoes at the seemingly helpless carrier and her escort, the destroyer Hamon. The torpedoes struck both ships, sinking the Hamon instantly and delivering the coup de grace to the valiant Yorktown. The carrier that had survived the Coral Sea and the morning's air attacks finally succumbed to the submarine's attack, taking with her the battle ensign she had flown proudly through 2 major engagements. As documented in John Parshall and Anthony Tully's meticulously researched Shattered Sword, the destruction of the Japanese carrier force at Midway represented more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic catastrophe that effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their experienced air groups created a gap in Japanese naval power that could never be filled. Despite the nation's desperate efforts to build replacement ships and train new pilots, Admiral Spruance, the quiet, methodical commander who had led the Enterprise and Hornet with such devastating effectiveness, received the first reports of the sinking carriers with characteristic understatement. His victory message to Admiral Nimitz was brief and professional. Enemy carriers damaged and burning will continue to search for and destroy enemy forces. The former cruiser commander, thrust into carrier operations by the fortunes of war, had proven that superior intelligence and sound tactical judgment could overcome numerical disadvantage. The sun set on June 4 with the balance of power in the Pacific fundamentally altered. The Japanese Empire, which had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier, now faced the prospect of a long defensive war against an enemy whose industrial capacity was just beginning to reach its full potential. The dawn of June 5, 1942 revealed a Pacific Ocean fundamentally transformed from the previous morning's confident Japanese advance. Admiral Yamamoto, his dreams of decisive victory shattered by the devastating defeat at Midway, faced the agonizing decision of whether to continue the operation or withdraw his remaining forces. The combined fleet commander, aboard the massive battleship Yamato, possessed overwhelming surface superiority with his 11 battleships and supporting cruisers, but the loss of air cover made his powerful fleet vulnerable to land-based aircraft from Midway and any remaining American carriers. The psychological impact of the defeat rippled through the Japanese fleet like a tsunami. Officers and men who had believed in their invincibility since Pearl Harbor now confronted the harsh reality that the tide of war had turned. Captain Mitsuo Fukita, the air commander who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and was scheduled to command the Midway strike before being grounded by appendicitis, later wrote that the defeat was really a miracle of God that saved America from potential invasion. Yamamoto's decision to withdraw, made at 2:30 in the morning of June 5, effectively ended Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. The admiral who had once proclaimed that he would dictate terms of peace in the White House now faced the prospect of a prolonged defensive war against an enemy whose industrial capacity was just beginning to reach its full potential. His chief of staff, Admiral Matomu Yugaki, recorded in his diary the somber realization that the combined fleet has been defeated and must now fight for survival. The American victory at Midway was not without cost. The loss of the Yorktown and her experienced crew, including many veterans of the Coral Sea battle, represented a significant blow to American naval aviation. However, the United States possessed something that Japan lacked: the industrial capacity to replace losses and the training infrastructure to produce new pilots. American shipyards were already laying down keels for new Essex-class carriers, while pilot training programs were expanding to meet the demands of a global war. Admiral Nimitz, receiving the battle reports at his Pearl Harbor headquarters, immediately grasped the strategic implications of the victory. The Japanese combined fleet, stripped of its carrier aviation, could no longer threaten Hawaii or the American West Coast. More importantly, the path was now clear for American offensive operations in the Central Pacific, beginning with the invasion of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands that would eventually lead to the Philippines and Japan itself. The intelligence triumph that had made the victory possible was carefully concealed from public knowledge. The code-breaking efforts of Commander Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO remained classified, allowing American cryptanalysts to continue reading Japanese communications for months to come. This intelligence advantage would prove crucial in subsequent operations, giving American commanders unprecedented insight into enemy intentions and capabilities. As reported in the Chicago Tribune's controversial coverage of the battle, which nearly exposed the fact that American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese communications, the victory at Midway marked the beginning of the end for Japanese ambitions in the Pacific. The newspaper's account, though potentially damaging to operational security, captured the euphoria that swept through America as news of the victory spread across the nation. The Japanese government, faced with the impossible task of explaining the devastating defeat to their people, imposed strict censorship on all news of the battle. The families of the 3,200 sailors and aviators who had perished were told only that their loved ones had died gloriously in battle, with no mention of the catastrophic nature of the defeat. This deception would continue throughout the war, as the Japanese military struggled to maintain morale in the face of mounting losses. The strategic consequences of Midway extended far beyond the immediate military implications. The defeat marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific, as American forces began the bloody island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring the war to the Japanese homeland. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Russo-Japanese War, lay shattered on the bottom of the Pacific along with the 4 fleet carriers. For the United States, Midway represented validation of the doctrine of carrier-based aviation and the importance of naval intelligence. The victory demonstrated that properly used intelligence could overcome numerical disadvantage and that carrier aircraft, rather than battleships, would be the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. The lessons learned at Midway would influence American naval strategy for the remainder of the conflict and beyond. The battle also marked the emergence of a new generation of American naval leaders who would guide the Pacific Fleet to ultimate victory. Admirals Spruance, Fletcher, and the pilots who had pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds had proven that American courage and determination could match any enemy, given the proper tools and leadership. The reverberations of the Battle of Midway extended far beyond the coral atolls and vast waters of the Central Pacific, fundamentally altering the trajectory of World War II and establishing the foundation for American naval supremacy that would endure for generations. In the months following the decisive victory, the true magnitude of the Japanese defeat became apparent to military strategists on both sides of the Pacific, though the full implications would not be felt by the Japanese public until much later. In the war, the industrial war machine that President Franklin Roosevelt had promised to build was now hitting its stride. With American shipyards launching new Essex-class carriers at an unprecedented rate, the USS Essex herself would be commissioned in December of 1942, followed by a steady stream of her sister ships that would form the backbone of the Pacific Fleet's offensive power. Each new carrier represented not just advanced technology but also the accumulated lessons learned from the Midway experience, incorporating improved damage control systems, enhanced aviation facilities, and superior defensive armament. The human dimension of the victory took on almost mythical proportions as the stories of individual heroism emerged from the classified after-action reports. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose decision to extend his search beyond the planned fuel limit had led to the discovery of the Japanese fleet, received the Navy Cross and promotion to commander. His navigator, Lieutenant Walter Ch, was similarly honored for his role in the most consequential navigation decision of the Pacific War. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 became a rallying cry for naval aviators throughout the fleet, with new squadrons requesting the honor of carrying the VT designation. The Japanese Navy's attempt to rebuild its carrier force met with limited success despite heroic efforts by shipyard workers and aircraft manufacturers. The new carriers Taiho Shikaku and Zuikaku, while technologically advanced, lacked the most crucial element: experienced pilots. The training programs that had produced the elite aviators of Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific campaigns required years to complete, time that Japan no longer possessed. The replacement pilots, rushed through abbreviated training courses, possessed neither the skill nor the experience of their predecessors, a deficiency that would prove catastrophic in future engagements. Admiral Yamamoto, haunted by the defeat at Midway, attempted to regain the initiative through a complex operation to capture Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Solomons campaign that followed became a grinding war of attrition that Japan could not sustain. The architect of Pearl Harbor, perhaps seeking redemption or death, insisted on personally inspecting frontline positions in the Solomon Islands despite intelligence warnings that American forces had intercepted his travel plans. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid, Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down over Bougainville by P-38 fighters in a mission codenamed Operation Vengeance. The strategic lessons of Midway were carefully studied and incorporated into American naval doctrine. The importance of intelligence, demonstrated so dramatically by the code-breaking triumph, led to massive expansions in signals intelligence capabilities. The value of concentrated carrier operations, proven by the coordinated strikes that had destroyed the Japanese fleet, influenced the development of fast carrier task forces that would spearhead the advance across the Pacific. The crucial role of damage control, exemplified by the Yorktown's remarkable recovery from severe battle damage, became a cornerstone of American naval training. The victory at Midway also marked the beginning of the end for the traditional battleship as the primary instrument of naval power. The sight of Admiral Yamamoto's 11 battleships withdrawing from the battle without firing a shot demonstrated that the age of the dreadnought was passing. Future naval engagements would be decided by carrier aircraft rather than heavy guns, a reality that would reshape naval architecture and strategy for decades to come. The propaganda value of the victory was immediately recognized by the Roosevelt administration, though the full story could not be told without compromising ongoing intelligence operations. The Battle of Midway became a symbol of American resilience and determination, proof that the attack on Pearl Harbor had not broken the nation's spirit but had instead awakened a sleeping giant. The victory provided much-needed good news during a period when American forces were struggling in North Africa and the Atlantic U-boat campaign was at its peak. For the families of the men who had died in the battle, the victory brought a measure of consolation that their sacrifice had not been in vain. The widows and children of Torpedo Squadron 8, the crew members of the Yorktown, and the Marines who had defended Midway could take pride in knowing that their loved ones had died in a battle that had changed the course of history. Memorial services held across America honored not just the fallen but the living who had proven that democracy and freedom could triumph over tyranny and aggression. The Battle of Midway entered American folklore as the moment when the tide of war turned decisively in favor of the United States. June 4, 1942 became a date that would live in memory alongside December 7, 1941, not as a day of infamy but as a day of redemption. The victory demonstrated that American industrial might, combined with intelligence, courage, and superior tactics, could overcome any enemy, no matter how formidable they might appear. The lesson of Midway that superior intelligence and sound strategy could triumph over numerical superiority would influence American military thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The battle established precedents for joint operations, intelligence cooperation, and the importance of technological superiority that would guide American defense policy for generations. Most importantly, it proved that free societies, when properly led and adequately equipped, possessed an inherent advantage over totalitarian regimes that no amount of military hardware could overcome. In the end, the Battle of Midway represented more than a tactical victory or even a strategic turning point. It was a vindication of the American way of war, demonstrating that a democratic society could produce leaders, warriors, and weapon systems superior to those of any dictatorship. The victory at Midway not only saved America from potential invasion, but also set the stage for the liberation of the Pacific and the ultimate triumph of freedom over tyranny.